In 2025, while missiles continued to fall on Ukrainian cities and soldiers remained locked in brutal trench warfare, the most important battlefield quietly shifted away from the front lines. Far from the sound of artillery, the United States and Russia, two of the world's most powerful nuclear-armed nations, came together for a high-level summit. There were no dramatic announcements, no celebratory handshakes, broadcast live to the world, and no clear promises of peace. Yet this meeting carried consequences far beyond a single press conference. For many observers, the summit raised an uncomfortable question. If Ukraine is still fighting, then why are Washington and Moscow talking? And more importantly, did this summit actually change the course of the Ukraine war? Or was it simply another chapter in a long history of strategic deception and power politics? To understand the significance of this moment, we must look beyond headlines and into the deeper realities of geopolitics. Global power shifts, and the long-term calculations driving both the United States and Russia. How the Ukraine war reached a breaking point by 2025, the Ukraine war had entered a dangerous phase. What began years earlier as a regional conflict had evolved into a global crisis with far-reaching consequences. Europe was facing economic strain, global energy markets were unstable, food prices had surged across the developing world, and military stockpiles in NATO countries were under pressure. The war had also become deeply political within the United States. Billions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine sparked debate in Congress and among American voters. While many supported defending Ukraine as a frontline democracy, others questioned how long the U.S. could sustain such involvement without clear victory or an endgame. Meanwhile, Russia, despite heavy sanctions, had not collapsed. Its economy adapted, its military adjusted tactics, and its leadership remained firmly in control. The battlefield became less about rapid advances and more about endurance, attrition, and political will. This stalemate created the conditions that made the 2025 summit not just possible but necessary. Why the United States agreed to the summit from the American perspective, the decision to engage Russia was driven by realism, not idealism. Washington faced multiple global pressures at once. The war in Ukraine demanded constant attention, yet it was no longer the only strategic concern. China's growing military power, its influence in the Indo-Pacific, and its challenge to U.S. technological dominance required long-term focus. At the same time, instability in the Middle East, rising tensions over Taiwan, and global economic uncertainty stretched American strategic capacity. For us policymakers, one thing became clear. An open-ended war in Ukraine risked draining resources and attention needed elsewhere. Talking to Russia did not mean abandoning Ukraine, it meant preventing the conflict from spiraling into a direct NATO-Russia confrontation or a wider European war. The summit was also about control. The United States wanted to manage escalation, reduce the risk of miscalculation, and keep communication channels open between two nuclear powers. History had taught Washington that silence between rivals is often more dangerous than dialogue. Russia's objectives, leverage, survival. Russia entered the summit from a position of pressure but not defeat. Sanctions had damaged its economy, but they had not broken the state. Moscow's leadership understood that total victory was unlikely, but so was total loss. For Russia, the summit served several purposes. First, it signaled that Moscow could not be isolated completely. Sitting at the table with Washington reaffirmed Russia's status as a global power whose interests must be considered. Second, Russia sought leverage. Any form of dialogue raised hopes of sanctions relief, recognition of territorial realities, or at least a pause in further escalation. Even without formal agreements, talks themselves created political and economic breathing space. Third, Russia wanted time. Time to rebuild military capacity, stabilize domestic conditions, and adapt to a new global environment shaped by sanctions and shifting alliances. In geopolitics, time is often more valuable than territory. One of the most striking aspects of the 2025 U.S.-Russia summit was what did not happen. There was no joint declaration of peace, no roadmap for ending the war, no immediate changes on the battlefield. This silence confused many observers, but for experienced diplomats, it spoke volumes. The absence of public commitment suggested that both sides were unwilling to lock themselves into promises they might later abandon. Instead, the summit focused on risk reduction, keeping military communication lines open, avoiding accidental escalation, and setting informal boundaries on what actions would cross unacceptable thresholds. This was not diplomacy designed to end a war overnight. It was diplomacy designed to prevent catastrophe. What the summit meant for Ukraine. For Ukraine, the summit was deeply unsettling. The war was being fought on Ukrainian land by Ukrainian soldiers. Yet the most powerful decisions were being discussed elsewhere. U.S. military aid continued, and public support for Ukraine remained strong. However, the summit reinforced a harsh reality of international politics. Smaller states often become arenas where larger powers negotiate their interests. Ukraine's future was no longer determined solely by battlefield outcomes. It was increasingly shaped by broader geopolitical calculations, NATO unity, U.S.-Russia stability, and global strategic priorities. This did not mean Ukraine was abandoned, but it did mean that the war had evolved from a fight for survival into a bargaining chip in a much larger power struggle. NATO, Europe, and the war fatigue factor. By 2025, NATO unity was under strain. European nations faced rising defense costs, public fatigue, and economic pressure. Energy prices and inflation affected daily life, making continued support for the war politically challenging. The U.S.-Russia summit reassured some European leaders that Washington was actively managing the risk of escalation. For others, it raised concerns about whether Europe's security was being negotiated without full transparency. NATO remained committed to Ukraine, but the summit highlighted a growing truth. Alliances are strongest when interests align, and prolonged wars test even the strongest partnerships. The summit revealed something even deeper than the future of Ukraine. It exposed how the global order is changing. This war is not just about borders. It is about who sets the rules of international behavior. For the United States, defending Ukraine supports a rules-based order where force does not redraw maps. For Russia, resisting Western dominance is about survival in a system it believes is stacked against it. The summit showed that the conflict had become less about winning and more about managing decline, influence, and credibility on the world stage. Did the summit change the war? On the battlefield, the answer is simple. No immediate change. Fighting continued. Lives were still lost. Strategically, however, the war entered a new phase. Communication replaced total confrontation. Managed rivalry replaced uncontrolled escalation. The risk of sudden disaster direct NATO-Russia conflict, nuclear signaling, or massive expansion was reduced. This shift may not feel dramatic, but in global politics, it is significant. Many wars do not end with treaties. They end with fatigue, negotiation, and quiet understandings. A war without an ending yet. The 2025 U.S.-Russia summit was not about peace. It was about power, limits, and survival. It did not end the Ukraine war, but it changed how the war is fought, discussed, and controlled. As long as Washington and Moscow continue to talk, the world remains suspended between stability and escalation. The future of Ukraine, Europe, and global security now depends not just on soldiers and weapons, but on strategy, patience, and the fragile balance of power. History may one day judge this summit as the moment the war stopped expanding, or the moment it quietly settled into a long, unresolved standoff. Either way, it reminds us of a hard truth. In geopolitics, wars are rarely ended by courage alone. They're ended when power decides it has gone far enough.